The burner was still on. That was the first thing Officer Dale Pruitt noticed when he stepped through the front door of the house on Sycamore Hill Road on the evening of March 11, 1985. The smell of something scorched. A pot on the back left burner of the avocado green stove, the water boiled off. The pasta underneath it blackened and stuck. Beside the stove, a cutting board with half an onion on it, a knife laid flat. A dish towel folded over the oven handled the way someone folds a dish towel when they intend to come back to it in a moment. He stood in the kitchen of Ruth Callender's house in Faro, West Virginia, and understood that whatever had pulled this woman away from her stove had not given her time to turn off the burner. Ruth Callender was 53 years old. She lived alone. Her car was in the driveway. Her purse was on the hook by the front door. Her reading glasses were on the arm of the chair in the living room, folded, waiting. The television was off. The lights were on. The front door had been unlocked, which was how it was always unlocked in Faro, a town of 4,000 in the eastern part of the state, where locking your front door was something people did in winter, mostly to keep out the cold. She was not in the house. 39 years later, the house would tell them where she had gone. But before we get to what the walls of 14 Sycamore Hill Road finally gave up, before we get to the renovation crew and the morning in September 2024 that unraveled 4 decades of silence, we have to go back to who Ruth Callender was to this town. Because you cannot understand what was lost in that kitchen without first understanding the life that was interrupted at the stove. Faro, West Virginia sat in a crease between 2 ridgelines in the eastern part of the state. The kind of town that existed because a coal company had once needed it to, and then had pulled back until only the people remained, the way towns like Faro always do, stubborn, particular, shaped by the fact of having been left behind and having kept going anyway. By 1985, the mine that had built the town had been closed for 11 years. What remained was a school, 3 churches, a volunteer fire department, a diner on Main Street called Pauline's that served breakfast until 2 in the afternoon, and the kind of community that forms when people decide, without quite deciding it, to stay. Ruth Callender had been born in Faro and had never had a serious reason to leave. She had worked for 21 years as a bookkeeper at the County Agricultural Extension Office. The woman who knew where every dollar went and how every account balanced, and who could find an error in a ledger from 4 years ago by memory alone. Her supervisor, Charles Dinkins, told investigators that Ruth was the kind of employee you stopped noticing, because everything always worked, and that he had understood his own reliance on her only after she was gone. She was a member of the First Baptist Choir, a second soprano who had sung at every Christmas cantata and Easter service since 1967. She visited her mother, Vera, every Sunday afternoon without exception, bringing a covered dish and staying through dinner. She had been married once, briefly in her late 20s, to a man named Earl Callender who had moved to Charleston in 1962 and with whom she had maintained, by all accounts, a civil and distant nothing. She had a daughter. Nora was 28 in 1985, living in Morgantown, finishing a nursing degree. Nora called her mother every Sunday night after Ruth got home from Vera's. That was the call that went unanswered on the evening of March 10th. Nora let it ring 10 times, hung up, figured her mother had stayed late at Vera's, and called again Monday morning. Monday morning, no answer either. She called Charles Dinkins at the extension office. Ruth hadn't come in, hadn't called in sick, hadn't sent word. Nora called the Faro police at 11:15 a.m. On March 11, 1985, Officer Dale Pruitt arrived at 14 Sycamore Hill Road at 6:04 p.m. after completing his shift. He knocked. He tried the door. He stepped inside. The burner was still on. The Faro Police Department had 4 sworn officers in 1985. They called the county sheriff immediately. The county sheriff called the West Virginia State Police. By the morning of March 12th, the state police had taken primary jurisdiction and assigned Corporal James Tilley as lead investigator. Tilley was thorough, systematic, and badly under-resourced. He had 1 assistant, a shared office with 2 other cases in active file, and the particular forensic limitations of a small state investigation in 1985, node-NA profiling, fingerprint comparison done by hand against a partial index, and a physical evidence lab in Charleston with a 10-week turnaround. He worked what he had. The house on Sycamore Hill Road yielded 2 items of interest. The first was a smudged partial print on the inside frame of the kitchen window, which was unlocked and showed faint signs of having been recently opened. The second was a single button, navy blue, 4-hole, the kind found on a work shirt or a heavy jacket found between the kitchen baseboard and the floor, partially behind the refrigerator. Neither Ruth's daughter nor her mother recognized it as belonging to Ruth. Tilley interviewed 41 residents of Faro in the first 3 weeks. He built a list of persons of interest. A man named Carl Briggs, who had been fired from the extension office 2 months earlier over a dispute with management that Ruth had documented in her ledgers. A seasonal worker named Roy Estes, who had done yard work for 3 properties on Sycamore Hill Road the previous summer and whose whereabouts on the night of March 10th could not be fully established. And a neighbor, Bernard Lyle, 61, who lived 4 houses down and whose name came up twice in separate interviews without being directly connected to anything specific. Briggs had an alibi. He had been at his brother's house in Clarksburg on March 10th, confirmed by 3 family members. Estes had moved to Kentucky in November 1984 and could be placed there on the relevant dates. Bernard Lyle cooperated with interviews, expressed concern for Ruth's well-being, and gave no account that contradicted any established fact. The partial print from the kitchen window did not match any print in the state index. Ruth Callender was not found. No remains were recovered. No witness came forward who had seen anything on the evening of March 10th. The navy button went unmatched. By the summer of 1986, the state police had no active investigative threads to pursue, and the case had effectively stalled, though it was never formally closed. Nora Callender drove down from Morgantown and cleaned out her grandmother Vera's house after Vera died in 1991, and then came back and cleaned out 14 Sycamore Hill Road the following year, when the property passed through probate. She packed her mother's things into boxes. She took the reading glasses off the chair and put them in a zipper bag, and put the zipper bag in a box and drove it back to Morgantown, and put the box in a closet, and it was there when she checked on it in 1994. And in 2001, and in 2009, and every few years after that. She was not sure what she was checking for. She checked anyway. The house on Sycamore Hill Road sold 3 times between 1992 and 2018. The third owners, a couple named Gary and Melanie Thorne, bought it in 2018 with the intention of renovating it for a rental property. They knew the history of the house. Faro was not a town where history like that stayed unknown. They had discussed it before they bought it and decided it did not change their plans. The renovation stalled twice, once in 2020 for reasons that stalled every project that year, and once in 2022 when their contractor retired. By 2024, they had found a new crew and scheduled the work for late summer. The kitchen and the back bathroom were the priorities. The walls in both rooms had not been opened since the house was built in 1951. On September 9, 2024, a construction worker named Marcus Webb was removing the drywall panel between the kitchen and the back hallway when his pry bar caught something that wasn't insulation. He stopped. He looked. He called his crew chief over. The crew chief looked. He called Gary Thorne. Gary Thorne called the Faro police. The responding officer, a 29-year-old named Deputy Claire Holt, who had grown up in Faro and had heard about Ruth Callender her whole life, arrived at 14 Sycamore Hill Road and stepped into the kitchen and looked at the gap in the wall where the drywall had been removed. She called the county sheriff. The county sheriff called the West Virginia State Police. The state police called their cold case forensic unit in Charleston. Within 48 hours, the entire kitchen wall had been documented and carefully opened. What the forensic team recovered from within the wall cavity, human remains, skeletal, partially preserved by the conditions of the enclosed space, was sufficient for identification. Dental records comparison, conducted against Nora Callender's dental records submission from 1986, when the original missing persons report had prompted next of kin documentation, confirmed the identity on September 26, 2024. It was Ruth Callender. She had been in the wall of her own kitchen for 39 years. The forensic analysis established that Ruth had died from blunt force trauma to the head, a homicide, as it had always been a homicide, as Nora Callender had always known it was a homicide. As the pot on the stove, and the knife on the cutting board, and the purse on the hook by the door had been saying for 39 years to anyone willing to hear it. The investigation that followed was the fastest the cold case unit had ever conducted on a case of that age. Because inside the wall cavity, alongside Ruth's remains, the forensic team found the navy button that had gone missing from the kitchen floor sometime between James Tilley's evidence collection in March 1985 and the arrival of the next investigator. It had fallen into the wall through a gap at the baseboard, the same gap behind the refrigerator where Tilley had first found it, and had been there ever since. And the partial fingerprint from the kitchen window frame, photographed in 1985 and never matched against any record in the state index, was run through the modern AFIS database in October 2024. It matched Bernard Lyle. Bernard Lyle had died in 2019 at 85 years old in a care facility outside Charleston. He left no family. He had lived in Faro until 2003, when he sold his house on Sycamore Hill Road, 4 doors down from where Ruth Callender's remains lay inside a wall, and moved away quietly. No one had thought to look for a reason. People moved away from Faro. It was the thing that happened. The West Virginia State Police issued a formal statement in November 2024, identifying Bernard Lyle as the suspect responsible for Ruth Callender's death. He could not be charged. He could not stand trial. He could not look at Nora Callender across a courtroom and be made to account for what he had done. But he had a name now attached to it. And the house on Sycamore Hill Road had finally said it. Ruth Callender was 53 years old on the evening of March 10, 1985. She had been to her mother's house for Sunday dinner. She had driven home. She had put a pot of water on the stove and laid an onion on the cutting board and folded a dish towel over the oven handle and set down her reading glasses and was making supper in the way that she made supper every evening of her life. Unhurried, ordinary, present, and she was interrupted. She never got to finish making dinner. She never got to hear the phone ring Sunday night. She never got to see Nora finish her nursing degree or see her own grandchildren, or grow old in the town where she had been born and had always intended to stay. Nora Callender was 67 years old when she received the notification call in September 2024. She had been a nurse for 37 years by then, which is the kind of work that teaches a person something about what it means to wait beside something you cannot fix. She was asked by the Victim Services Liaison whether she wanted to make a statement to the press. She said she needed a day. The statement she gave the following afternoon was short. She said, "My mother was a woman who showed up. She showed up for her job and her church and her mother and her daughter, and she showed up at that stove every night. Someone took her before she could turn off the burner. It took 39 years to know who. I want people to understand that I never stopped knowing that she didn't leave on her own. The house knew. It just took that long for someone to open the wall. The reading glasses are still in the zipper bag. Nora said she doesn't know what she'll do with them yet. She said she thought that was all right, that not knowing yet was all right. The case of Ruth Callender is now cited in West Virginia law enforcement training as an illustration of the value of long-term physical evidence preservation and of the expanding capabilities of modern forensic databases to resolve identifications that earlier technology could not. The partial print that sat unmatched in a file for 39 years took 4 days to match in 2024. 4 days. There are things this case puts in front of you that don't resolve cleanly. Bernard Lyle died in 2019, 5 years before the house gave him up. Is it justice when the person responsible is already gone and the only thing a verdict could have given to Nora Callender is the sound of it being said out loud in a room where it had to be heard? What does it mean that he lived on the same street for nearly 20 years after, that Nora may have driven past his house during those visits back to Faro, not knowing? And for the forensic investigators who closed this case in 2024, what is the word for what they gave Nora Callender if it isn't quite justice and it isn't quite peace, but it is something true and real and long overdue? 39 years. A pot on the stove and a button behind a refrigerator and 4 days in a modern database and a woman's name finally said out loud as the answer to a question her daughter never stopped asking. The house on Sycamore Hill Road finally answered. Justice found Ruth Callender after 39 years. Stories like hers are why this channel exists. If you believe truth is worth pursuing no matter how long it takes, subscribe so you don't miss the next case. More are waiting in the description below. Thank you for being here.